I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about what it means, and particularly what it's meant to me, to study and research a professional doctorate. So I am now a doctor of professional practice, which really means that I've taken my experience, my professional experience, and I've used that as the basis for my research and inquiry. As it happens, I produced a thesis, and then that has been my doctoral work, and that's been adjudged to be of the correct standard. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about that, and really to encourage people that are practitioners, that have experience, that maybe want something a little bit more. You know, you're pretty good at your job, you know exactly what you're doing, you've risen up through the ranks, maybe you hold a managerial position, you've got experience, but there's something else, there's a yearning for a little bit more, and that could well be a yearning to develop yourself. And that's really where I think the doctorate is something to consider. I'll tell you a little bit about me. Now, I am a practitioner. I've always been a self-learner. I try things out, I learn, I make lots of mistakes. And that's how I learn. Not very good at formal education. In fact, I didn't even get a bachelor's degree. I dropped out of a thin sandwich course as was, and I transferred to a higher national diploma. But I've nonetheless achieved a lot. Ironically, I've taught a lot as well. I am an engineer, my training was as an engineer, and I feel myself to be an engineer because I like that process of diagnostic and problem solving and testing and design and retesting. And I like all of that. But I'm also quite interested in the psychology and the coaching. So I have this strange mix of both, you know, hard and soft, or scientific and naturalistic sensibilities, and that really made for for me a far richer and more interesting doctoral journey. And I would say that because of it, I've vastly extended my capabilities. Not only do I understand the value of evidence-based decisions, but I actually know how to gather that evidence and to make those decisions. I also found it a way to resolve the seeming inconsistencies and incompatibilities between my different brains and different ways of thinking, and actually come to value that, and really it formed part of my research. What you might expect from me is something like this, you know, a slide that's fairly dense, that defines what a professional doctorate is, that's backed by quotes and literary or literature references. And this is true, and all of this on this slide is absolutely correct. And what's interesting for me is it demonstrates the difference, the tension, if you like, between an academic approach, whereby here is the information, here are both sides of the argument, here's the knowledge that already exists and what's known, which is very much the academic approach, versus the practitioner. I don't have to think too much. I just want a quick answer. Should I do a doctorate or not? So I love the tension between that. And you know, we're not going to go through this slide, but I am going to tell you what's in it in far more of a practitioner-oriented way. My experience of the doctoral journey is this. It's a synthesis. It typically starts with what is already known. Now, if you're doing a PhD, what is already known is a purely literary research. But because you've got practitioner knowledge, you come into that by saying, I already know quite a lot of this stuff. You can either augment your own knowledge by researching into the literature, or you can look at it the other way around and say, look, I'm going to develop the literature further by adding what I already know. And it is very much a process of synthesis. Now, actually, AI is a very helpful tool in that these days. It's going to help you find things that are similar to things, and it's also going to help you summarize these papers, some of which are very hard to read, and it's difficult cognitively. It's difficult. So AI is really, really helpful. Nothing, of course, replaces the going back in and reading the paper and getting to understand it deeply. And that is merely a process of familiarization. And it will happen. It absolutely will happen by the time you've written a few pieces and you've looked at some research. You will become very familiar with certain authors and certain papers. And then from that, initial search, literature search, what I did certainly was I pulled together several domains of academic knowledge, and I pulled those together to form, what I thought of was my conceptual framework. So I was interested in what's happening with digital transformation. So we know that firms wanted to do some kind of transformation, and it doesn't really matter what the outcomes they wanted were, but let's say they want to save money and be faster and better. I found that there was an area of literature that existed called organizational ambidexterity that I felt resonated with some of my approaches very much. Within each area, within a management area, you could have this idea of doing two things at once, both in effectively what is production or operation. And that's called ambidexterity. I didn't know that beforehand, right? But I did know that in most organizations, we have a change the business and a run the business, or a CapEx and an OpEx budget. So straight away, I saw that similarity. And that's really what you as a practitioner bring to academia, is you start to make these connections that say, that's why that is like that, or that's where that came from. Because academics have to observe what happens in practice, and then they say, we think people are doing this because of this, and they're developing theories. And of course, the more you look at this and you look at papers and you look at research that's emerged, the more you start to develop that language of developing your own theory. And that's exactly what I did, is I took a synthesis, I synthesized all of these things, and I said, actually what they're really doing is they're managing tensions. Of course, if you're trying to transform something, if you're trying to do any type of organizational change, there will be a resistance to change. Okay, so there's a tension. And then you start to go, well, how do people overcome that resistance? And the amazing thing about my research, and this was the complete surprise, a lot of it, you kind of go, yeah, that's obvious and that's predictable, was that I found that roughly half of the managers I spoke to felt no agency whatsoever to resolve any of the tensions that they experienced. They're all great with tensions. They all got it. Yeah, talk for hours about the tensions. And then I'd ask, well, how do you resolve that? And not all of them knew. So, that was the sort of the conceptual literary areas that I was looking at. And then from that and from these interviews, I was able to say, yeah, actually, there is a sort of a theory here, is that if an organization is going to be adaptable, which we know in the digital age is really important, you can't just go on being the same old machine, you've got to adapt to the market, then that's going to develop this ambidextrous performance. You're good at both innovating and operating, but you need to be adaptable to do that. And part of being adaptable is learning how to manage tensions. Great example is, what do you do with your managers that are really good in the old way of working and you want to adapt to the new way? You can't throw those people away, because actually they've got a lot of knowledge. They've got great expertise. They really understand the business, the market, the people, right? They're industry experts. So what you want to be able to do with those is get them to lead this adaptation. And they do that by managing the tensions. And suddenly you realize, look, these are fairly soft skills that we're talking about. These are people skills, not technical skills. And then I went back to the conversations that I'd had with participants and started to pull out what are the themes. And you can be fancy and call this a thematic analysis. And from that, I was able to say, yeah, actually, if we say that targeting this adaptable efficiency is a really good idea, let's aim for that, not just being cost efficient, but being efficient in the way that we adapt and efficient in the way that we operate. And maybe embracing some stuff from paradox, which is, instead of saying, well, we're either going to do this or that, look at how do we do both of these things, right? How do we make that both work? Maybe instead of telling people what to do and how to do it, we manage the conditions around the workplace so that we're managing the tensions in collaboration with the people doing the work. Maybe we inspire people to keep on learning, because if they're learning, they're going to learn how to adapt. And then finally there's a bit of a problem sometimes with ego and personalities that have negative effects. And also there is a move, certainly in the digital world, to more connected organizations, whereby you don't have, one central organization or dominant body, ego, firm that says, this is the contract, it's all going to be done my way. And we move much more towards a collaborative, ecosystemic way of working, where people maybe move more informally in and out, and they produce great things. This starts to develop a new movement. And look, I'm really excited about it. And like every doctoral candidate I've ever met, we all want to change the world. And 3 years later, I've got something to say about that. So I said I wanted to encourage you to think about this. Let's start with this question: is why would you hire a university, right? And I would encourage you to think about that. If you're considering a doctorate, PhD, why hire a university? Because which university you hire is a detail of that. What do you want to do? And then, what is the difference between the PhD approach, which is very much, I want to study this question, and this is the right methodology to make that study, and you do the study and then you write it up, and you're essentially being examined on how well you applied the methodology and whether it was the right methodology. Whereas in a professional doctorate, it's much more about, I'm interested in this area because this is fascinating, and I think this is going on, and it matters to others because of this. So they both have the same academic rigor and value, but it's a very different sort of approach. One is an experience-led approach, and I'm looking for an explanation. The other is much more, I'm going to stay very objective about this because I mustn't let my bias taint the results. If you're doing a PhD, you are really trying to get the license to be a researcher, because you're probably heading or considering heading for an academic career. Whereas typically people doing a doctorate are interested in their own personal development. You get both, of course, but it's just there's an emphasis. I would say the thing that matters the most, more than your university, but associated with that, is your supervisory team. I had a fantastic team. They were brilliant, and they were different and opposite. And then the second most important thing is your cohort. It's the people that you're studying alongside. We had a fantastic cohort and a great WhatsApp community. Very supportive, very inclusive, really, really wonderful. And I think that makes a huge difference. So there you go. Hopefully that's given you a little bit of a taste of what it's like to do a doctoral research degree.